Hello. Welcome to the Pirate History Podcast. My name is Matt. Thank you for listening. In the coming weeks, we're going to be moving on from what historians have coined the Buccaneer era of piracy. In more than a few ways, the stories we're about to tell are some of the first of real piracy here on the Pirate History Podcast. There have been acts of piracy and even a few real pirates so far, but most of our characters have been privateers and had yet to throw off those shackles of empire and the law that later pirates would. The French and English buccaneers in the Pacific that we've been talking about were engaging in piracy, but they still saw themselves as loyal patriots. Those ties to civilization were still there, but they're about to start breaking down. One of the side effects of the separation from the civilized world is a distance from accurate history. Privateers might have the benefit of gentlemen on board that would write of their activities, but pirates rarely did. Most of the stories of pirates that have been passed down to us as legitimate history are, at the best, half myth. In part, my goal on this show has been to cut through the myths surrounding piracy. I think it's vital to ground pirates and piracy in the real world in which they lived. However, if we look only at the agreed-upon evidence-based facts about pirates, the story grows sterile. It would become a recitation of dates and names, and if I told the story like that, it would take a couple of weeks at best and be unbelievably dry. We can't ignore the myths of piracy. How we see pirates and how people at the time saw them defined the pirates, and it even changed the behavior of pirates to come. So we need to look at the myths and legends behind piracy. We need to distinguish between fact and speculation, but we can't discard the speculation or the fictions. This is a problem we've run into before, and it will only get more and more prominent as time moves on. And it's a problem that we have here at the end of the Second Pacific Adventure. Without William Dampier, the records get a lot more suspect. Renaud de Lussan is an engaging storyteller, but less of a historian, less of a chronicler. However, he's what we have, so we're going to look at his tale, for good or ill. This is episode 70, Truth and Lies. Last time we rushed through 1686 in the story of the second buccaneer incursion into the Pacific Ocean. Edward Davis, Francois Groenet, Jean Rose, George Dew, Pierre Le Picard, and Mathurin de Marté raided up and down the coasts of Central and South America. They all wound up at Drake's Isle, at Isla de Plata, but at different times, as did a Spanish fleet that was built to destroy them. When we left off, Groenet, Picard, de Marté, and Dew had left Drake's Isle. 8 of Edward Davis's men accompanied them, but Davis himself was sailing north in Bachelor's Delight to join them. Their target was Guayaquil, and it was a tempting target. It was a port city that served the mines in the Andes and the nearby plantations. Silver, slaves, coffee, and cocoa flowed from her docks, and they made the city rich. Today, Guayaquil is the largest city in Ecuador and one of the largest ports on the Pacific coast of South America, though in 1687 it was still part of the Viceroyalty of Peru. But in 1687, Guayaquil was not terribly well defended. Lima was the capital and fortified, but Guayaquil had rarely had to fear invasion. No European powers had ever come here in strength, and all that the city ever had to worry about was piracy. Now, there have been several attempts on Guayaquil by pirates, but most of them were unsuccessful. Back in 1681, the First Pacific Adventure raided the city. Charles Swan and John Eaton and Edward Davis, well, they tried for it in 1685, just 2 years earlier, but they had been rebuffed. It wasn't a city defended by an armada and shore batteries and an army and countless fortifications like Lima, but it wasn't without defenses. There were forts, there was a militia, and a standing guard. Renaud de Lussan calls the city Guayaquil, which may be a more accurate representation of the 17th century name of the city. I might switch over to that from time to time because I like the way it sounds, and it looks at first glance like quesadilla. But if I read that in a quote from Lussan, understand that it's the same city. By 11 April 1687, the pirates were in sight of the coast, the mainland coast of South America. In the distance, on the horizon, they saw what was probably that Spanish fleet that had been sent out to deal with them, so they furled their sails to hide from view. Luckily, a fog suddenly arose, which hid both the armada and the pirates from one another, and it allowed the pirates to escape. 4 days later, on the 15th, they were at White Cape, or Cabo Blanco. They left some men behind to watch out for Captain Davis. Whenever he arrived in Bachelor's Delight, they would guide him to Guayaquil and the rest of the pirates. Let me describe the Bay of Guayaquil. It's dominated by one large island called Isla del Muerto, Island of the Dead, or Dead Man's Isle. The Isla de Muerta is not an uncommon trope in pirate lore. In the first Pirates of the Caribbean movie, the cursed Aztec gold is kept at Isla de Muerta. In Treasure Island, Captain Flint's map names the location of the treasure as Skeleton Island. Usually, in the movies, the Isle of the Dead looks suspiciously like a skull, and in Curse of the Black Pearl, it can't be found except by those who already know where it is hidden. Well, I know where it is hidden. It's in Ecuador, in the Bay of Guayaquil. The Dead Man's Isle in the Bay of Guayaquil doesn't look like a skull. It looks like a body, covered with a shroud. The rolling hills on one end suggest a face, and then moving on to a belly, and at the far end there's a mountain peak that looks very much like a pair of feet. It's, when viewed from the right angle, sort of an optical illusion that you can't unsee. When you get closer to the mainland, there is an archipelago of smaller islands, but still large enough for people to live on. By 1687, those islands were home to local Native American tribes. It would be best, when the pirates were nearby those islands, to avoid them, if at all possible. As you sail north, up the bay, toward the city itself, there will be a delta, a river that is split into many smaller channels. There's 3 primary channels, but countless tributaries and creeks. Now, the coast, once you get beyond the delta, is relatively open lowland, but just to the east, the Andes Mountains dominate the skyline. There's a narrow strip of lowland between the coast and the mountains called the Neck. Now, south of that, the land opens up, and north it opens up as well a bit, but the mountains are always there. They're a constant backdrop to the city of Guayaquil. Now, Guayaquil lies to the north of the Neck, on that river. They call it the Pearl of the Pacific. The pirates disembarked there at Cabo Blanco. They didn't want to take their large ships all the way in. They could have taken them further, but it probably would have elicited notice. So they rowed smaller boats and took single-masted vessels deeper into the bay. They made for a channel between 2 of the islands in that archipelago, Santa Clara and La Puna. Now, those are 2 of the larger islands. Once they were home to a large shipyard where many of Peru's greatest ships were built and housed. Only 30 years earlier, they had been home to perhaps a dozen 5th and 6th rate ships of the line. Now, they weren't a patch on the shipyards at Cadiz or even Cartagena, but they would have kept the pirates at bay. They weren't there to defend against invasion, but it was a safe port at which to build ships that could then be transported to the West Indies or even back to Spain if necessary. But by 1687, those shipyards were quiet. They had been abandoned in favor of better shipyards at Lima. Now, those islands were home to just sleepy fishing villages. They did still have about 40 soldiers garrisoned on La Puna to watch the approach to Guayaquil, but the pirates knew about those guards, and they knew where they slept from one of the prisoners they had captured earlier. When the pirates put those guards to the question, the guards answered freely. They told Groyne everything they knew about Guayaquil, about her defenses and her layout. This gave Groyne everything he needed to prepare an attack against the city, except one thing. Last time we talked about the Spanish fleet that was bearing down on Isla de Plata, searching for the pirates. Now, we know, because we talked about it last time, that that fleet will fail to find the pirates and split up in search of them. And we also know that Edward Davis is going to sail along and stumble into a fight that will turn into a protracted drunken sea battle with that Spanish flagship. and we know that he will eventually beach her, capture the crew, and remove that frigate from the equation. However, the pirates here in the Bay of Guayaquil on La Puna didn't know any of that. The threat of the Spanish hung over their heads this entire time. They knew that a fleet might sail around the bend at any minute. If they were caught in the bay, they would be caught out in small open boats, and if they were caught on the march, which was a real possibility, at least in their minds, that a Spanish army might make landfall and squeeze the pirates between that army and the walls of Guayaquil. That threat informed everything that the pirates did here, at least at first. It might have motivated them to move as fast as they did. They might have wanted to get behind the walls of the city before that Spanish army arrived. They split up into 4 columns for the march as well as for the attack on the city. Now, each of the columns was commanded by one of the most prominent captains in their ranks. Each of the captains and the pirates beneath them had a job to do, according to the plan, and if things went according to that plan, they would take a different part of the city and each of them move in towards the center of town. In the Buccaneers of America, Alexander Exquemelin called the vanguard, the soldiers at the front of the army, the forlorn, but Raveneau de Lussan takes it a step further. He calls it the forlorn hope. I like this a lot. It's much more honest. Medieval armies would shower those in the most dangerous positions like the vanguard with promises of glory and honor. At least medieval commanders and medieval writers would. They told the soldiers that they would be remembered in song and were certain to live on eternally in heaven. But pirates had no such notions. To be honest, most regular soldiers probably didn't either. But pirates didn't believe in honor or glory. Many of them didn't believe in heaven. They didn't think any of that was going to be waiting for them. They knew that no one would sing songs of them. Maybe a few drunken pirates would remember them. But after all, somebody has to be in the front of the army. And if you are one of those, well, abandon hope. The forlorn hope was led by Captain Picard, 50 pirates strong. Captain Mathurin de Marté was the commander of the reserves, which were the most heavily armed pirates in the army. Lussan calls them 80 grenadiers. Now, I'm not a qualified linguist, however fascinated I might be by the activities of a living language. However, people that are qualified linguists usually mark the first recorded use of the English word grenade around the time of the Glorious Revolution in England. We'll be talking about that later, but that happens in about 1688. Here, in 1687, a French writer used the word grenadier. Now, the word grenade comes originally from Latin, as so much of the English language does. Medieval Latin speakers called the pomegranate the pomum, or apple, and granatum, or seeded. Pomum granatum, pomegranate. The French derivation of the word was pomegrenade, and later just grenade. Some French soldiers saw similarities between the seeds in a pomegranate and the gunpowder and shrapnel in the explosive devices that they used. They called them, colloquially, grenades, and those that used them, grenadiers. Englishmen, once they came to the New World, were surrounded by native French and Spanish speakers, and they picked up the term and called them grenades. A 17th century grenade was just a small cast iron pot. It was filled with rough gunpowder and capped with a wick. Now, sometimes they would put shrapnel in there as well, but not always, and it wasn't necessary. That wick would be lit, and then, either by hand or with a sling, tossed at people that you wanted to kill, or at least to seriously maim. The 80 grenadiers under Captain Mathurin de Marté would have had grenades. They also would have had muskets, or quite possibly heavier guns, like a blunderbuss. Perhaps some of them even carried light artillery. They would serve as heavily armed shock troops in this army. Now, their role was as a reserve force. Basically, the plan was, wherever the fighting was growing too hot, de Marté would march his 80 men in and light the Spanish up. They would throw grenades and fire pots and shoot volleys of large shot at them. Now, François Groenet was in ultimate command of the army, and he commanded the main body of the army. But then there was the last force, 50 pirates strong, commanded by, well, whoever it was that took over the captaincy of Captain Townley. Luzon calls him George Hewitt, but it was probably George Dew. Those 50 were supposed to capture an outlying fort near Guayaquil. From the walls of that fort, they would be able to guard the retreat of the rest of the army, should that become necessary. In that force, under George Dew, any ensign that managed to raise the flag of the pirates atop the fortress, which would signal the march on Guayaquil for the rest of the army, was to be awarded with 1,000 pieces of eight. Now, originally, the plan was for each of the columns of pirates to approach Guayaquil by boat. They would row upriver to reach the city. However, the pirates didn't know the region, and they timed their first approach poorly. They were defeated by the current. It pushed them back into the bay. They realized, okay, bad timing, let's go back to the island. But once ashore, the pirates were spotted. They didn't realize they'd been spotted, but a house far up on a hill on the mainland suddenly burst into flame. It was a signal fire to Guayaquil. The pirates threw any caution they had had aside. They stormed the beach and charged up the hill. The Spanish soldiers were waiting for them. They fired on the pirates, but there weren't many. Every Spanish soldier that showed his face was shot down. The pirates fought the blaze, and they actually got it out relatively quickly. In total, it had only burned for a few minutes. The French and English once again ran, this time to the nearest tree line. They hunkered down in the trees and they stayed silent. They set out watchmen to keep a keen eye on the city. If the people of Guayaquil had spotted the signal, the usual procedure was to light a return fire, a sign that the original signal had been seen. At least that would be the procedure in traditional warfare. Someone would light a fire in request of aid, and whoever saw the fire would light a return fire and then march out to give them aid. That would also let the enemy know that reinforcements were coming. That was a scare tactic of sorts. But there was no one out here that needed aid. Only a burned shack, half a dozen dead Spaniards, and maybe 300 pirates. So the pirates weren't sure whether or not the people of Guayaquil would light a return fire if they had in fact seen the original fire. The pirates waited all day. They didn't see any fires lit, nor did they see any columns of Spanish soldiers come out to meet them. It appeared that they had escaped notice and killed anyone that could give warning of their coming. When nightfall came, the pirates slipped out of the tree line and back to the river. They took their boats upstream toward Guayaquil. When dawn was close, they made landfall and carried their boats inland and hid them under cover. Then they made camp and slept throughout the day. As the sun sank on the 19th, Groenet ordered 6 men to stay behind to watch the boats. They were given strict orders not to light fires, not to leave cover. There was to be no singing and no talking. Whispering was okay. If you were a man who snored, stay awake. There were regular patrols near the river, and they would be on sharp lookout, so the orders were to avoid notice at all costs. The rest of the force set off for Guayaquil. However, one of those 6 men who was left to watch the boats just couldn't abide sitting around all day without having a smoke. He lit a fire. I'm sure it was a small fire. He needed to light his pipe. Now, most of the pirates, the main body of the pirates, didn't know that he had lit the fire. What they did know is that the Spanish strictly forbade any of their soldiers lighting fires at night, except while in camp. That's why Groenet had forbidden the lighting of fires. From the direction of the boats, the pirates, the main body of the pirates, heard the sound of a blunderbuss shot, a loud, cracking boom that hung in the air. Then, from the direction of Guayaquil, a thunderous sound. Every cannon in the city fired at once. That blunderbuss was a signal, and this time the army of Guayaquil had received it. The plan, the big plan that they had worked on, now had to be thrown out. There was no need for caution anymore, so the entire force of pirates marched on the city. Now, that's according to Raveneau de Lussan, and Lussan is not to be trusted. There are things we can verify in the story. We do know that on 20 May 1687, the French and English buccaneers attacked Guayaquil. There are Spanish records that corroborate this. It happened. However, those records were written by Spanish officials that weren't there. Luçon was there, and his account, well, it is the best we have. It's a first-hand account, but it's filled with lies. According to Luçon, the pirates, quote, marched out toward the town with our drums beating, colors flying. Upon our approach, found ourselves stopped by 700 men, end quote. Now, when they marched on the town with drums beating and colors flying, Guayaquil was still some distance off. This wasn't the garrison at the fort or the town militia. This was an army, I suppose. The 700 Spanish soldiers had the advantage of a trench and a barricade. From behind that, they fired on the pirates, and Luçon tells us, quote, they had the boldness to sally out upon us with sword in hand, end quote. That is impetuous. I mean, would you do that? Imagine you had a good barricade behind which you can duck down into a trench whenever the pirates start shooting. You have well over twice the number of the pirates. Would you sally forth? Or would you hang back, keep your defensive advantage, and kill the pirates to a man? Now, those numbers may have given the Spanish a sense of hubris. It would be heroic, wouldn't it? Even noble to sally forth into battle. It becomes less heroic when 260-odd buccaneers chase the Spanish off with the ferocity of their firing. Luçon calls what they gave the Spanish a vigorous reception. Now, Luçon has no compunction with fudging the numbers a bit here and there, especially when it makes Spain look cowardly and France look like conquering heroes. This kind of writing found a warm reception back in France, even up to King Louis's court. That may have something to do with why Ravenel de Luçon could style himself, later in life, Sieur Ravenel de Luçon. Now, according to his record, the Spanish army fled to the nearest fort, and the pirates chased them thence from fort to fort until only one of the forts remained. This might be true. But it wasn't 700 men that they were chasing from their high walls filled with cannon. According to Luçon, the battle lasted 11 hours, and in the end the pirates lost only 9 men with 11 wounded. The Spanish, on the other hand, lost hundreds. When all was said and done, after 11 hours of fighting, the forts were captured, and Luçon writes, quote, we sent out several parties at the same time to pursue those that fled, while the other Roman Catholics went to sing Te Deum in the great church. End quote. I mean, maybe. Devout Christians would certainly visit the church after a successful battle. The French were Catholic, and the Spanish had Catholic churches. They were different sects of Catholicism, but who's to say that the French wouldn't do that? But I will say that if you were writing a manuscript and you hoped to catch the eye of the Sun King, God's chosen monarch who was notable for his patronage of the arts, including writers, it might do to add a bit of religion to your great defeat against the Spaniard. In reality, the battle there at Guayaquil looked more like this. Governor Juan Alvarez de Avila did see that signal fire. He ordered General Fernando Ponce de Leon to rally the men and stand ready. The pirates' plan to lay low for the day was a good one. By the time that they actually moved against the city, the militia in Guayaquil was wearying. Many of the guards were lax, some of them napping. This allowed George Dew to sail 2 periaguas to the town docks in the warehouse district. His pirates captured the warehouses and occupied them. That was his job. Now, Luçon fails to tell us whether or not somebody did raise a flag and get 1,000 pieces of 8. Meanwhile, the Forlorn and the main army, led by Picard and Groenet, well, they let the current carry them past the town. They were supposed to disembark before the gates and march in, as Luçon says, with colors flying and drums drumming, but they didn't. The current carried them too far. When they were finally able to put their boats on shore, they were forced to wade through a marshland to get to dry land, and then they had to take refuge in an abandoned house while their wicks and their powder dried. They waited until morning, and as the sun rose, it began to rain. This gave the general Ponce de Leon the chance to advance with 300 soldiers, not 700, and it was a force made up mostly of slaves. All of the commanders were Spanish, but all of the men who had to stand there and die would have been slaves, and those aren't usually men willing to die to defend their master's money. So the pirates charged those 300 men. Several of the pirates jumped over a small rampart between themselves and the Spanish force. They assumed that was a barricade, but it was difficult to see in the early morning with rain pouring down. It wasn't a barricade, it was a levee, and it led into a canal several feet down and a bit too steep and too wet to climb back up, at least where the fighting was. When they realized their mistake, the rest of the pirates held back and the two forces shot muskets at each other across the canal, but there was really little effect in that battle. But a small group of pirates did sneak upstream, and they waded across the canal, some of them using wooden planks, and they held their guns above their head to keep them dry. They were able to flank the Spanish force. They came in firing from a side street. The general, Ponce de Leon, was wounded, and the Spanish force fell back. See, that's what I'm looking for. I'm not looking for tales of gallant men sallying forth with banners held high to defeat their foe in honorable combat. If I wanted that, I'd read about the Crusades or something. I want stories of pirates, filthy, low-down pirates. I want them sneaking around and outsmarting the honorable enemy, doing whatever it takes to win. The Spanish force pulled back to the town square, where there were reinforcements waiting. Groenet marched the main force of the army toward the square and entered into battle. Honorable, stand up and shoot the enemy battle. However, Captain Picard was busy circling around the Spanish. It was the same move as before, only this time with way more pirates. Again, the Spanish forces pulled back. This gave Guayaquil's town square and their main thoroughfare, Los Morlacos Street, to the pirates. They pulled back to the last Spanish stronghold near the Dominican monastery in town. The Spanish stronghold was up on a hill, and it put their backs against the heights leading up to the Andes Mountains. Now, on that height they had a rampart and a trench from which there was no way for the pirates to sneak around and surprise them here, but there was also no escape. The Spanish had cannon up there. The pirates would be forced to climb the hill to reach them there. It was almost a good plan. The massed Spanish forces, which were now close to 700 at this point, would fire down musket balls and grape shot and cannonballs down at the pirates trying to ascend. It should have worked. The main problem is that they couldn't get their cannons to point down the hill at the right angle. They just shot harmlessly over the pirates' heads while they climbed. Now the muskets could reach the pirates. The Spanish musketeers popped their head up from behind cover and fired, wave after wave, at the pirates. It kept the pirates at bay, behind their own cover, but without cannon, the Spanish and the pirates, they were at a stalemate. So Groenet ordered the reserves forward, commanded by Mathurin de Marte, the 80 grenadiers. That force split into two columns and marched around the rest of the pirates on either side of the trench. When they were close, they crawled to get close to the trench near either end. Now, the Spanish saw them coming, but there was only so much you could do when men were low to the ground. Each of the grenadiers lit the wick on his grenade, waited for several nerve-wrenching seconds, and then tossed his pomegranate, his cast-iron pot filled with gunpowder, into the trench. At almost the same moment, either end of the trench erupted in smoke and fire and screams. The grenadiers jumped down into the trench and fired their muskets. Some fired the blunderbuss, others a long gun, but they took aim and fired on any Spaniards still standing. Now the trench was fairly long, and it was filled with soldiers. Even with the grenades and that initial musket volley, the center of the trench was still filled with living men. The grenadiers would have had pistols as well, and sabers. They drew both and rushed toward the center, squeezing the Spanish between their two forces. Now, had that been it, the fight in the trenches, the outcome would have been in doubt. It would have been a hard fight. Men clashing steel, fighting with pistols when they had shot, but then it would have turned into an old-fashioned melee. There were more Spanish soldiers than pirates, but the Spanish were at a disadvantage. However, the grenadiers were not it. They were only there to distract the Spanish. Well, yeah, to kill a bunch of them, but to hold their attention. They were to stay in the trench and fight hard until the rest of the pirates could march up to the edge of the trench to fire a volley down at the Spanish and then rush the survivors with sabers and bayonets. Now, I know that I have said before that this battle or that battle was the last of the Buccaneer era. But don't worry, this is not a starting now kind of situation. Those earlier battles were fought by privateers, buccaneers. This group of men, a year or so earlier, fought one of those battles, and the buccaneers under Lord de Graaf up to the north. But this battle was fought by former privateers. They still had letters of marque, but they were invalid. The Spanish were aware of the fact. They knew that these men were not legitimate privateers any longer, and they made sure that the French were also aware of that fact back in Nicaragua. These men, somewhere deep in their hearts, might think of themselves as privateers, but they are really just pirates. I'd also like to remind you, before all of the unpleasantness that's to come, that these pirates wanted to leave the Pacific. They wanted to return home months back. According to Luzon and the letters of 2 Spanish governors, they tried to do so, but the Spanish hadn't allowed them to. Now, I get it. If a bunch of fools came into my house and ate all my bananas and rifled through my wallet, I'd want to get back at them. If they tried to leave with what was in my wallet, a part of me might want to stop them. But if they had guns, it might just be the smart move to cut my losses and let them go. Allow the cops to find them later. Now that doesn't make what follows the battle at Guayaquil the fault of the Spanish, especially not the victims here in Guayaquil. They had nothing to do with the actions of other Spanish people up in Nicaragua. It's still on the pirates. They did it. But just a little bit. It's the fault of the fools up in Nicaragua who wouldn't let the pirates leave. So the pirates had possession of Guayaquil. Now, the battle didn't last 11 hours. Perhaps it was 11 hours from the time that they set out to attack the city that morning, but the battle was over by about 11 a.m. There were somewhere in the neighborhood of 700 men defending the city, but that grand march against all 700 soldiers never took place. These were not knights riding into battle with drums drumming and pennants flying. The Spanish did not sally forth to do battle. The Spanish hid in a hole until you threw grenades at them. But that's not what the Sun King wants to hear. Possessing a city is not enough to hold a city. There is a population full of people that do not want you there. If you want to hold a city, you have to subdue the population. If you want to ransack a city, your tactics will be different. Last time, the pirates under Captains Francois Groinet, Pierre Le Picard, George Dew, and Mathurin de Marte attacked the city of Guayaquil and what was then the Viceroyalty of Peru. Edward Davis, captain of the frigate Bachelor's Delight, was rushing up from the south from the city of Paita to aid the other pirates against a Spanish armada. Now, we talked about the discrepancy between Raveneau de Luzon's account of the battle and the reality of the fight. Luzon couched everything in terms of valor and glory, which was far from the truth. Today we'll continue with that comparison, only instead of valor in battle, it will be a look at plunder and the power of French amour. This is episode 71, Dice for Your Life. The first few hours immediately following the conquest of a city are the most important. Even if you lay down perfect plans, see to every small item, cross your T's and dot the I's, triple-check every detail, even then, there will be mistakes. A city under occupation is tense but usually quiet. A city that just lost a battle, though, Well, if the conquering force has a fearful enough reputation, one might see women flinging themselves and even their children from the walls to avoid their attentions. The pirates weren't as feared as all that, but they were still reviled and despised and seen as a monstrous terror, devils in truth. The pirates, though, acted quickly to subdue any resistance in Guayaquil. Their main goals were to keep the local grandees from escaping and to stop any treasure from falling behind the sofa. These pirates we're talking about, they were most concerned with the treasure, at least at first. Ravenel de Luçon tells us about the treasure that they took immediately after their victory in Guayaquil, and you wouldn't believe the riches they found. He writes, quote, "A great many pearls and precious stones, a prodigious quantity of silver plate, and 70,000 pieces of eight at least, though there were 3 millions among them when we came thither. And a vermilion eagle gilt that served for a tabernacle to some church, weighing 68 pounds, as well for 2 rocks of emeralds, where the eyes of it were made." End quote. That's a great treasure indeed. 70,000 pieces of 8 pearls and stones and a 68-pound gold eagle. But wouldn't you know it, quote, "The masters of the forts laid hold of that opportunity to make their escape along the river with the greatest part of their most valuable movables. When our canoes were come to anchor under the town, 4 of them went away in pursuit of the sloops that carried the said riches of the town away. But then it was too late." End quote. The pirates grabbed what they could immediately in town, but even more important than the booty was the capturing of prisoners. They had the soldiers all ready, but the populace was still running free. They took anyone of consequence hostage and marched them to a nearby church and locked them inside. This was pretty typical practice for the pirates. They intended to capture the people and hold them for ransom. Finally, though, they made their way to the governor's mansion. Luçon writes, "We found this governor's house so richly furnished and filled with such precious movables that nothing in Europe could be more magnificent." End quote. Now that's not true. Versailles existed, but the governor's house still must have been pretty nice. They agreed with the governor on a price for all of the goods they held, for the families in town, for the town itself, for the fort and all of its munitions, for the cannons, and for the ships in the harbor. They agreed on 1,000,000 pieces of 8 in gold and 400 sacks of corn. This left the pirates with a few days of hard work ahead of them. They had to patrol the streets, they had to set guards on the prisoners, and finally, they had to transport all of their goods that they had taken back to the boats and then back to the ships. Now, the pirates shared the work out equally among them, so that they all had some time in town. They all had to labor, but they all could enjoy the pleasures that Guayaquil had to offer. Ravenel de Luçon tells us that the women of the town were very beautiful. They had been misled by the fathers of the town into believing the pirates were inhuman monsters that would kill them and eat their babies. However, and my voice cannot drip with enough sarcasm to give this next passage its due, the women of Guayaquil, according to Ravenel de Luçon, had, quote, "horror and aversion for us, that they could not be dispossessed thereof till they came to know us better. But then I can boldly say they entertained quite different sentiments of our persons, and having given frequent instances of so violent a passion, has proceeded sometimes even to a degree of folly." End quote. Once they got to know us, you know what I'm saying? You picking up what I'm laying down? Yeah, you know what I'm saying. Ha ha! If you aren't smelling what Luçon was cooking, he breaks it down further for you. Quote, "Some of our men grew very familiar with our women prisoners, who, without offering them any violence, were not sparing of their favors. After they came once to know us, they did not retain all the aversion for us that had been inculcated into them when we were strangers." End quote. All of this has the ring of some sleazeball in a bar who failed to seal the deal, and bragging later on to his buddies. Yeah, you know how those Spanish girls are, they can't get enough. Luçon tells us of one woman in particular, a beautiful young Spaniard, a gentlewoman, a handmaid to the governess, in fact. He was marching her to one of the churches when, quote, "she turned back and with tears in her eyes told me in her own language, 'Señor, por l'amor de Dios, no me como.' That is, pray, sir, for the love of God, do not eat me. Whereupon I asked her who told her that we were wont to eat people. She answered, the fathers, who had also assured them that we had not human shape, but that we all resembled monkeys. End quote. He infers that this beautiful gentlewoman learned firsthand that he was very much human, and that she showed so violent a passion for him as proceeded even to folly. Then he spins out a great yarn. That young gentlewoman, with tears in her eyes, was the wife of the treasurer of Guayaquil, the same treasurer of Guayaquil that had been killed when the pirates attacked the day before. As you might imagine, once this young widow, who had lost her husband yesterday, found out that Lusan wasn't a cannibalistic devil monkey, she jumped right into his arms. Lusan's charms were so great that, quote, now that woman appeared so far comforted for her loss that she proposed to hide me and herself on some corner of the island till our people were gone, and that then she would bring me to Guayaquil to marry her, that she would procure me her husband's office and vest me in his estates, which was very great. End quote. I try to avoid swearing on this show. I do. Kids might be listening, and even though we talk about beheading from time to time, my language is something that I can control, but sometimes it's so hard. When the right word is there, right in front of you. If this were Sunday school, I might say that Lusan's story is a big old pile of manure. And look, there is the question of publishing. A good French story, one that was going to sell anyway, had to have a little bit of everything. Religion and patriotism, which, if you remember the attack on Guayaquil, his story had in spades. It had to have an anti-Spanish propaganda, which is what this entire story is about. It had to have some good old-fashioned blood and violence, and then just a little bit of sex. Otherwise, it wouldn't be exciting. And in Louis XIV's France, actual concubines were the norm. At least among the classes with enough money to buy books. Everyone had extramarital lovers. If your husband didn't have at least one mistress, most wives would be a little embarrassed. Your husband must not be handsome or charming enough to attract anyone else. Often, wives would ask their friends to introduce their husbands around, and if you were a woman whose only relationship was with her husband, well, the shame would just be too great to show your face at the salon. This kind of makes sense in a world where marriage was about property rights and alliances. Love was a thing for peasants or for concubines. And most audiences in France would eat that story up. A beautiful young Spanish bride falling for the French conqueror. Of course, those Spanish hussies gave their violent passions so frequently a turn to folly. I mean, French men are just so handsome and virile, they couldn't help it. But let's remember here, Spanish colonial America was not Paris. However nice the governor's house may have been, it wasn't Versailles. And these Spanish women were not Parisian gentry. They were wives, and they were mothers, and they were daughters who had just seen a group of violent Frenchmen kill their husbands and sons and fathers. That treasurer's wife that proposed to Lusan only a few days after her husband was killed, that's not how human beings work. That is not a situation conducive to willing concubinage. I mean, sure, maybe 300 buccaneers defeated the entire 700-strong Spanish army. Maybe they sallied forth with drums drumming and trumpets blaring and chased the Spanish army from fort to fort. The pirates did have a reputation for winning battles, especially on this voyage, so maybe that reputation preceded them. And then maybe they did take the opportunity to pray in the local church. They were legitimately pious Catholics, most of them. They were sinners, obviously, but they observed the forms of Catholicism. And then maybe there was more than 3 million pieces of eight in treasure lying around Guayaquil. It was a rich city. The Spanish did have a history, even, of escaping with most of a city's wealth just in the nick of time. I could suspend my disbelief to that point. Bravery, victory, and riches beyond belief, and then a moment of piety. I could go there, but those exotic Spanish women taking the pirates to bed willingly, even proposing marriage to them, and offering them their husband's former office? Perhaps there were women in Guayaquil, most of them slaves or the town's sex workers. Perhaps they were encouraged to entertain the pirates. That would have gone far in the interest of preserving the honor of the town's more respectable Spanish ladies. That's no better, but it may explain those violent passions. But let's remember, aside from the violence and the killing of Spanish soldiers, these men weren't Orlando Bloom here. The pirates that came in and sacked Guayaquil had been sleeping rough for years. They never ate properly. They were haggard men. They were almost certainly missing teeth from a lack of citrus, and most of them hadn't had a decent bath in some time. So, I find all of this very, very hard to believe. This is a story written to sell books, and it's not a bad story. In many ways, it's a perfect French story. You have to remember that the French at the time, and we're going to be talking a lot more about this in the days to come, were at the top of the world. These pirates were pirates and not exactly noblemen, but the French nation was the most rich and the most powerful and the most populous of nations in this decade. Those Parisian women who would have been reading these stories enjoyed reading stories about brave, handsome, dashing, roguish young Frenchmen overcoming the reluctance of the Spanish women. The French men who would have been reading this story, most of them, their husbands, would have enjoyed those stories even more. They would have been able to visualize themselves, also brave, handsome, and amorous Frenchmen, into the stories of these pirates. It's not unlike Indiana Jones. Indiana Jones is handsome, worldly, well-traveled, and always gets the girl. James Bond is another good example of that trope. These pirates, according to Raveneau de Lussan, filled that niche in the storytelling world, and these stories sold well. But we have to remember that there is very little, virtually no, historical documentation to back this up. The Spanish don't have records about their women falling into the arms of the French. Even if it did happen, and I don't believe it did, they wouldn't have written that down. So all we have to go on is the word of one man whose interest was more in selling books than historical accuracy. However, the events that follow do have corroborating Spanish sources, so let's move on. After about a week of the pirates in Guayaquil, a fire broke out in the city. Lussan assumed at first that it was reckless pirates that left a fire unattended. But the fire hit the granaries and the storehouses. The pirates fought the blaze and got it under control and finally extinguished, but a lot of goods and food were destroyed. Lussan says a third of the town was burned down, although the Spanish records say a bit less. Here's the problem with that. The pirates' agreement with the governor stipulated that Guayaquil go unharmed. If it burned, their agreement was nullified. The pirate captains had given strict instructions on the matter, not to leave any fires unattended. So, Pierre Le Picard, George Dew, and all of the officers save Francois Groinet went to go visit the governor. Groinet had been wounded in the battle and was resting up with the other wounded men. The governor, when they went to meet him, was imperious. He was furious, and he insisted that his agreement with the pirates was void. But Pierre Le Picard countered. It's funny how the storehouses that burned just happened to be the same storehouses in which all of the goods belonging to the pirates were kept. Their corn, their 400 pounds of corn, which was intended to feed them, all of their spices and dyes and sugar and coffee, all of that which was to be sold, most of that had been destroyed in the fire. A fire that, according to the agreement, released the town from paying any ransom to the pirates at all. What an inconvenient coincidence that turned out to be. The pirates suspected the governor of, quote, a mischievous intention to burn the merchandise and corn that were of so much use to us, end quote. So Picard informed the governor that if the ransom were not paid in full with an additional sum to replace the lost food and goods, he would see 50 heads sent on to the governor's mansion. If that failed to encourage compliance, Picard said, he would see that the pirates finished what the pirates assumed the governor's agents had started. They would burn Guayaquil to the ground. The governor insisted that the entire incident must have been some, quote, rascally, spiteful people that had done this, and he would take care to satisfy us, end quote. The governor furnished the pirates with a brand new ship and the men that were needed to load up all of the goods and the treasure that the pirates still held. They could take their ease in town. They could enjoy their time in the city, with those violently passionate women. Right about this time, Edward Davis was engaged in a battle with that Spanish frigate out in the bay. Now, this battle was happening way too far away for the pirates in Guayaquil to hear or see anything, so the pirates didn't know what was happening. But those lookouts that were left out in the bay by Francois Groenet did bring word of a Spanish frigate and a small fleet entering the bay. So Picard, who was second in command, sent enough men to crew a bark and to deal with any Spanish presence that might be lurking around in the bay. On the 2nd of May, Francois Groenet finally succumbed to his wounds. He had taken a cutlass to the leg, and that was in the rain and the mud during the attack in Guayaquil. Finally, that turned infected and killed him. Before Groenet had died, he had given orders to Pierre Le Picard, his second-in-command, and Picard had been seeing them out. But now he was in command of all of the forces in Guayaquil, and he ordered them out of the city. He wanted the pirates to return to their ships, anchored off La Puna Island. Their plan was to wait on La Puna for the ransom from the governor to be paid, but they did at long last have ships full of cargo and food from the city. Picard was a cautious pirate, but a prudent one. He wanted to be prepared for whatever might be coming for them. Their island was safer. They were nearby their ships where they could defend themselves better than they could in Guayaquil. The last orders given to the governor of Guayaquil was for a small unit of Spanish soldiers to carry all of the gold and silver and pearls that were to be paid as ransom to the pirates. But the deadline for that came and went. The pirates agreed to allow the town 4 more days to pay the ransom, and 4 days later, that Spanish squadron did arrive. Now, they weren't carrying chests of gold to the tune of 1 million pieces of 8. They were carrying an officer and a few soldiers and 1 prim bureaucrat. These Spanish men informed the pirates that the ransom was coming. They didn't have any reason to worry, but, these things take time, so why not just kick back and relax? That ransom will be here soon. If they had, in fact, encouraged some of the local women to entertain the pirates, this may have been the point, to buy them time. However, Picard saw through this. He ordered the Spaniards captured, and then, quote, "Now this made us suspect very much that there was some treachery in the case, and that they entertained us with hopes for no other end than to amuse us till such time as the enemy were reinforced, insomuch that we were constrained to use severity towards our prisoners, which we knew would strike a terror into our enemies. We made them dice for their lives, and the lot falling upon the heads of 4, we cut them off presently, and sent them to Guayaquil in the same vessel that had brought the said officer unto us." End quote. Once again the governor made an agreement. Upon receipt of the 4 heads, he agreed to send them 20,000 pieces of 8 immediately. The pirates agreed that upon receiving it they would leave Guayaquil and Guayaquil harbor forever. The following day, while they were waiting for the ransom, one of the barks that they sent out to scout for Spanish Navy ships sailed into view. The pirates on board told Captain Picard that they had indeed seen a frigate out there, much too big for them to fight. That bark ran for it, but the frigate chased them around the bay and then finally out to sea. Now those pirates gave that frigate the slip and came back to talk to Captain Picard about what had happened. Unfortunately, they hadn't actually given it the slip. Only a few hours later, the lookouts spotted sails on the horizon coming to La Puna Island. One of those scouts in the bark confirmed that it was the very same frigate that had chased them earlier. Apparently, they had been followed and found. Now, this put the pirates in a difficult situation. A frigate like that could tear them apart. They were in periaguas and barks with only a few heavy guns. Their biggest ships were that half-galley and one of the sloops taken in Guayaquil. They could run, they were faster than a frigate, but that monster was blocking their way out of the bay. One way or another, they were going to fall in range of her guns. Now, some of the men argued that the pirates should all return to Guayaquil. At least there would be walls for them to hide behind, but Picard put the nix on that. The governor was stalling them. There was clearly an army on the way to Guayaquil. With this frigate here and the potential of more ships to come, they were trapped. Their best option was to fight their way free, to take their plunder and escape the Bay of Guayaquil and the army that was certainly coming to crush them. Then another ship did appear at the mouth of the Bay of Guayaquil, this one a fat merchantman trailing the frigate. That merchantman stopped at the larger ship and then set sail toward the pirate vessels at La Puna. When she got in close, Captain Picard saw that they were in fact Englishmen, not Spanish, and that they were led by none other than Captain Edward Davis. That frigate that had given them all such a scare was Bachelor's Delight. Now, Captain Davis had the entire crew of that dreaded Spanish frigate in captivity below his decks. He told the story about fighting that frigate, running her aground, capturing the prisoners. And Picard realized that Davis had fought and bled to keep the French pirates on land safe, to guard their rear while they attacked the city. So everyone agreed that he and his men, all of the pirates on board Bachelor's Delight, had earned shares from the raid on Guayaquil. But Captain Davis had one other piece of news. That fat merchantman on which he sailed over to meet the pirates had been sent out of the city of Guayaquil clandestinely and slipped past the pirates, but Captain Davis had intercepted her before she got away. The captain of that merchantman carried a letter from the governor of Guayaquil, who had just made another deal with the pirates, to the viceroy in Lima. It read, quote, "Sir, I am to inform your excellency that the English and French are still at Puna. It's several days since the term they had allowed us for the redemption of our prisoners is expired. I have done it on purpose that your excellency might gain time. They have sent me 4 of our people's heads. I will amuse them with some thousands of pieces of 8 from time to time, though they have no reason to be wary, while your excellency may please to come. And though they should yet send me 50 heads more, I shall esteem that loss to be much less prejudicial to us than to offer such evil dispossessed people to live. Now, sir, we have a brave opportunity to get rid of them, provided your excellency lose no time to do it." End quote. Now that letter's only source comes to us from Luzon, not the official Spanish record, and I find it suspect. By suspect, I mean it's too perfect. The governor comes right out and says he is plotting against the pirates. He's callous and indifferent in how he brushes aside the beheading of his citizens. Now, I wouldn't put that beyond a commander or a governor of any colony to feel that way, but I would put it beyond them to say it. And then he goes on and says that the pirates have no reason to be wary. They were sending the pirates food, so that might be all that he was talking about. But then Raveneau de Lussan follows this up almost immediately with an account of his days on La Puna. They have music, Lussan says. They have lutes and guitars and harps, and then they have all of those concubines with which to pass the days. These are the prisoners, some of them, that they have with them, and yet he says that they are more than willing to entertain the pirates. That's what the letter's real author, Lussan, is referencing when he says that the pirates have no need to be wary. He doesn't want us, the reader, to forget how all the women just fell in love with the pirates. He tells us of his days with the treasurer's wife, and how, finally, he informs her he cannot stay. In form, at least, it's almost like some chivalric poem, but in substance, it breaks down basically to, "Sorry, babe, I'm a ramblin' man." That entire letter, I believe, was fabricated by Raveneau de Lussan to add a sense of legitimacy to the story that he was telling. Then, a few days later, the very same merchantman that carried Captain Davis returned. This time, though, she carried word of a real Spanish armadillo. Remember 2 episodes ago when that Spanish admiral sent a few of his ships away to search for the pirates elsewhere? Well, none of those vessels had found any pirates, and they all returned to Drake's Isle, as they were instructed to do, only to receive word from a messenger left on the island of a pirate attack on Guayaquil. The merchantmen brought in word that 2 small fleets of galleons and sloops and barks were closing in on the pirates. Now, Picard hadn't been idle this entire time. The men may have been enjoying wine and women and music on the beach, but Picard had outfitted 2 of the prizes taken in the raid on Guayaquil, a Spanish man-of-war and a sloop of war. They were respectable enough warships, but not enough to carry all the French pirates, and not enough to take on all of the Spanish galleons. However, they did still have Bachelor's Delight. So Picard ordered 80 of his best pirates to board her, to fully man the best ship in their fleet. Then he put the rest of his best pirates on board that man-of-war and that sloop, and then he gave Jean Rose command of the merchantmen. That fleet, Bachelor's Delight, the Spanish merchantmen, the man-of-war, and the sloop were all gunned and fully crewed. But that still only carried a fraction of the pirates there in the Bay of Guayaquil. Most of them were still on board periaguas or canoes. Those pirates took on whatever cargo they could carry, the most valuable cargo among the pirates. Several thousands of pieces of 8 in gold and silver, and the pearls and the rubies. They took all of that and rowed their boats into the shoals and the flats where the Armadilla couldn't follow. The pirates then chose to dump most of their prisoners on shore, and they actually gave them orders to wait on the ransom that was coming and collect it, to give to the pirates. Presumably, the pirates also left all of their concubines on shore as well, although at this point Lussan fails to mention them. You see, at this point he's past the kissing parts and now it's on to the fighting parts. Those 4 pirate ships sallied forth to meet the Spanish. In the Age of Sail, a battle at sea was kind of like a dance, maybe a tango. It's all about the chase. But they could take hours. Most of that time was spent sailing around, vying for position, trying to get into place for a decent shot. The actual shooting could be minimal, sometimes non-existent. Now, not the really big wartime naval engagements between great powers. When armadas of ships of the line clashed in large numbers, there was almost constant firing until one side was too beaten down to continue. But when a few smaller vessels met, it was usually mostly a struggle to get off that one perfect volley. Unfortunately, that means that stories about battles in the Age of Sail can be dull. They can take more than hours. They could take days. When those 4 pirate vessels sallied forth, the Armadilla was waiting for them at the mouth of the bay. It was there to block off their escape. See, there were more ships and an army coming down to reinforce Guayaquil. All that this Armadilla had to do was keep the pirates here. Whenever those 4 ships would approach, they tried to slip through this Spanish blockade, but those Spanish vessels shifted position and stopped the pirates dead. They would have them at a disadvantage. They would have them in range of their guns if the pirates continued on, so the pirates stopped and turned around. Now, there wasn't any shooting on that first day, just attempting to find a way to slip past the Spanish. At least there wasn't any shooting until after dusk, when Bachelor's Delight signaled an end to hostilities for the day by firing off a volley, and everyone, including the Spanish, lay anchor. The next day, everyone got up early to start the fight, but they found themselves becalmed. None of the ships had any wind, so they couldn't move, at least not until late in the afternoon. It was too late to fight by that point, so the pirates made for the coast. The Spanish shifted to make sure they weren't up to anything, but they didn't stop the pirates. They wouldn't be able to get away on land, at least not from that bit of coastline, but all the pirates wanted was to put land at their back, just in case. On the 3rd day of fighting, the 28th of May, the Spanish bore down on the pirate vessels. They got into range and opened fire, fully. The pirates got themselves in position and returned fire. Lussan writes, quote, "We fought till it was dark night. They very much shattered us, yet wounded but 1 man," end quote. The following day, the 29th, both sides held back, in the morning at least. That was just good form. After a day of engagement, it was good to give the other side time to get their rigging in order. That would give you time to get your rigging in order. After noon, though, the Spanish came in once again to attack that sloop of war, but one of the other ships in the pirate fleet rushed in to give aid, and this time, all of the vessels got in close. Now, the gunners fired the great guns over and over again, but there were men on deck employing their muskets as well, and neither side could get a man at the helm that could stand there for very long without a hail of musket shot coming at him and cutting him down. Now, Luzon claims that the pirates lost only one man through hours of concentrated fire, but the Spanish must have lost many more. Luzon knows this because of the torrent of blood-red water that flowed through the scupper holes. That is, of course, Luzon claiming once again that the pirates lost only 2 men in 2 days of fighting, but the Spanish had lost hundreds. I wonder what the men who had actually experienced naval combat at this time thought when they heard something like that. When the light finally failed, after another afternoon of fighting, the Spanish cried out, "A la mañana la partida." That is to say, "Good work, sleep well, I'll most likely kill you in the morning." The following day, both parties attempted to leave the bay. They wanted to pull back, but they both tried to pull back in the same direction. Both parties, both the Spanish and the pirates, prevented the other from doing so. There were a few rogue shots fired here and there, but most of them were warning shots to stay away. But the 31st of May saw another engagement. This time, the Spanish focused on the pirates' rigging. They had very little luck when they had attempted to attack the pirates on board, so if they could disable the vessels, they could, well, perhaps do other damage. They toppled 2 or 3 masts in that engagement. They ripped through sails and crossbeams and spoiled much of the pirates' tackle. So, rather than allow more damage to be done to their ships, Captain Picard made a decision. He ordered all the rest of the prisoners, the few that they had kept, brought up on deck. They were chained before the masts. They were tied up in the rigging, and finally, the ones that were left were lined up along the railing. I mean, that's sturdy play. They would not be able to fire on these Spanish citizens, and these weren't just random Spanish citizens. They were the most valuable prisoners taken in Guayaquil. Bishops, merchants, the general of the forces of Guayaquil were there, blocking the Spanish from firing. So the Spanish backed off. In the night, the pirates set about work transferring the men and the guns from their most damaged vessel, the sloop, to other ships. While they were at work, the Spanish attempted a sneak attack to board the man-o'-war, but the pirates weren't sleeping. They were all up and working, so the Spanish were repelled and backed off once again. The following day, the Spanish came back. This was the 7th day of fighting. This had been a full week of engaging one another on the sea. This time, the Spanish intended to board Bachelor's Delight. It was the largest and most dangerous of the pirate ships, and if they could board her and take her, well, the pirates would be forced to surrender. The pirates were less prepared this time than they had been the night before, so the Spanish were actually able to get one of their galleons in close to Bachelor's Delight and were sending out grapples to grab the pirate ship. But then, that man-o'-war under Captain Picard swooped in and opened fire. Now, this was a close engagement, and the Spanish almost pulled it off. However, Captain Picard had outfitted another vessel, a long bark, to sneak alongside the Spanish galleon and to attempt a boarding of her own. That long bark did grapple the galleon, and even got a few men to climb aboard and fighting on deck. Now, the Spanish on board their galleon were much stronger than this boarding party, but they had a frigate and a man-o'-war to deal with as well. They had their attention split 3 ways. They could have dealt with any one of those threats with no problem, but not all 3 of them at once. So they killed what boarders they could, and then cut loose and ran. The next morning, the 8th morning, the 2nd of June, there was another shooting engagement. The pirates and the Spanish fired at one another for hours, but the pirates were better with small arms than the Spanish were. Whenever they could get in close, they opened up with the muskets. They got so close at one point that the Spanish ships had to close their portholes and their gun batteries to barricade themselves within the ship. It was another long, bloody engagement. to hear Luzon tell it the pirates lost basically no one and the Spanish lost basically everybody. But the following morning, the pirates awoke once again prepared to fight. But they found that Spanish armadillo was nowhere to be seen. Apparently, they had taken enough damage and enough injury and enough dead, so they fled. Now, Spain might have been able to take this battle the first day, the first hour of fighting, if they had been willing to do what was needed. They had the ships and the guns and the numbers. But the pirates had Spanish prisoners on board, important Spanish prisoners. They also had thousands of pieces of eight and untold other riches. If the Spanish did sail in force and overwhelm the pirates with all of their big guns, well, those Spanish dignitaries and all of the pieces of eight and all of the gold and all of the pearls and the gems, well, that would be sinking to the bottom of the bay. However, if they could keep the pirates from escaping, perhaps they could wear them down and be able to reclaim all of those dignitaries and treasures. And then, on the 31st, they were close to forcing the pirates to surrender. But Picard had that move with the prisoners in his back pocket, using them as human shields to guard their ships. Now, this was against the laws of war and good conduct and human decency, but it worked. So the pirates set sail from the Bay of Guayaquil. They left the bay and found a cove on the mainland in which they could lay anchor and count their plunder. The men who knew numbers and a bit of arithmetic, and were also trustworthy enough, gathered in a room full of treasure to inventory just how much they had taken. The Spanish records show only 50,000 pieces of eight being paid out to the pirates, and that might actually be true. That might be how much the government of Guayaquil paid to the pirates. But that doesn't include the treasure that was taken during those first days of plunder. Luzon tells us that they had somewhere in the neighborhood of 500,000 pieces of eight in assorted gold, silver, and gems. The pirates who were doing the counting actually stopped counting far before they had an accurate account. They decided it would be better to organize it by chests and sacks. Eventually, they stopped counting the silver altogether and chose to just distribute 400 pieces of eight to every pirate. Now, at first, when the pirates heard that news, they were upset. 400 pieces of eight wasn't much, and there is a lot more of it, so why aren't we getting it? Some of the men demanded that they go back to Cabo Blanco to see if their ransom had arrived. But Captain Picard cut them short. He said those two armadillas had been sent to pay us with cannonball. Then he gave the pirates the full news. This 400 pieces of eight was, well, it wasn't their share, it was a stipend. There was so much more. Too much to count. Not just silver, but several 100,000 in assorted indigo, dyes, all sorts of cargo, not to mention gold and gemstones and pearls. The gold was mostly uncoined. Any gold that was mined in Peru was sent to Lima, where they had a proper mint. That made it hard to weigh the gold for distribution. Similarly, the gemstones were uncut and difficult to give an accurate value to, so instead of handing out shares, they would hand out silver and allow the men an auction. They were allowed to bid on everything. Now, the pistols that they took in Guayaquil, which were apparently very fine pistols, sold at a base price of 15 pieces of eight each. Those sold immediately. But then the men bid on nuggets of gold and gemstones until every pirate in the fleet had what they wanted. Then they started gambling. Each of the pirates was in possession of more money than they had ever seen before. The pirates on board Bachelor's Delight doubled everything that they had earned so far on their voyage. Now, fortunes were being traded on the toss of a dice, and that was fine because they had plenty more. The drunk men were losing farms that they might have bought back in Port Royal or Cap Francais. However, while all of this debauchery was going on deck, the assembled captains talked. Edward Davis was preparing to round South America, to return home to the West Indies, so he bartered out a deal with all of the other captains, with Pierre Le Picard and Mathurin Desmartais and all of them. He wanted to buy any cargo that the other captains and crews might have. There was sugar and indigo and dyes and coffee. He wanted to buy that with silver and gold. See, Bachelor's Delight was the largest ship in the fleet. She had the biggest holds in the fleet, and she would actually be able to carry all of that valuable cargo. And then Captain Davis would be able to sell it when he returned home. And if he was clever, he would be able to earn even more money from it. So he traded the gold and gems for indigo and coffee. And the other captains were happy to make that trade, not only because they wanted more gold and gems, they knew they might be able to sell it for more back home as well, but none of their ships were capable of making the trip around the Horn or through the Straits of Magellan. All of those pirates on their smaller vessels might have to abandon those ships and carry whatever plunder they had on their back. On 12 June 1687, Edward Davis set sail south. His first stop was to be the Galapagos, and then the Straits of Magellan, and then home. The rest of the pirates, all of them now assembled under Pierre Le Picard, decided instead to sail north. Now, they might have crossed through Darien. That seemed like the most likely option. But they didn't have any ships waiting for them on the other side of the isthmus. They wanted to know that they had a secure way home. They didn't want to wind up on the coast of the North Sea and be stuck there with sacks full of treasure and no way to spend it. So they ventured instead further west and further north until they were well into the waters of New Spain, even deep into the Gulf of California. Up there, they would find another group of French privateers that were legitimate privateers carrying letters of marque, that were much more in touch with civilization. Those new privateers actually recruited the crews of Captain Picard and all of the rest back into the fold for the next war with Spain, the 9 Years' War. There is a lot more raiding in their future, and we will return to the story of Pierre Le Picard and Ravenel de Lussan and Mathurin de Marté as they struggle to find their way home. Eventually, we will follow them as they return home, only to fight under and alongside La Ronde de Graaf. And we will follow George Dew as well. George Dew was a longtime friend of these French pirates, but when the war breaks out, he is forced to make a decision, whether or not to stay with his friends or to fight with his countrymen on the other side of that war. And we will follow him when he meets his new compatriot, a man named William Kidd.